$300 million. Gone. Not stolen in a single night, not taken at gunpoint, not traced to a single account. Vanished slowly, systematically, right under the noses of the FBI, the Nevada Gaming Commission, and every law enforcement agency in America. The men who took it never wore masks. They wore suits. They sat in boardrooms. They shook hands with senators. And when it was all over, when the trials ended and the gavels fell and the headlines moved on, the money was still gone. And the men who took most of it were still free. This is the story of the greatest theft in Las Vegas history. And nobody was ever arrested for the best part of it. To understand how $300 million disappeared from the Las Vegas casino industry without a single conviction, you have to understand something most people never knew about Vegas in the first place. The casinos were not just places to gamble. They were machines. Perfectly engineered, carefully maintained, deliberately obscure machines designed to move cash from one place to another without the government ever seeing it clearly enough to count it. Before the age of computer tracking, before surveillance cameras blanketed every square inch of casino floors, before digital slot machines recorded every pull on a central server, cash moved through a Las Vegas casino like water through sand. It went in fast, and it went everywhere. The slot machines ate it. The tables collected it. The cage sorted it. And somewhere between the moment a gambler laid his money down and the moment that money got reported to the IRS, a portion of it simply disappeared. They called it the skim. It was not complicated in theory. It was just theft. Money would come off the casino floor before it ever reached the official count. Trusted employees would pull cash from slot machine drop boxes before the count team arrived. Coin scales in the slot accounting rooms would be rigged to underreport weight. Table game totals would be quietly adjusted. 100,000 here, 200,000 there. Night after night, week after week, year after year. Nobody questioned it because the people running the skim were the same people running the casino. And the people running the casino were connected to men you did not question. In 1958, when the Stardust opened as the largest hotel in the world, Las Vegas was still a city where the mob did not hide. It operated, openly, confidently, with the kind of institutional arrogance that comes from owning the judges, the sheriffs, and half the state legislature. The Chicago outfit, the Milwaukee family, the Cleveland syndicate, the Kansas City organization. These were not criminal enterprises trying to stay invisible. They were businesses. Businesses that happened to operate outside the law. And the skim was their dividend, their quarterly earnings report, their return on investment. For nearly 30 years, from the late 1950s through the mid-1980s, organized crime skimmed an estimated $300 million from Las Vegas casinos. Some experts put the number higher. Nobody puts it lower. $300 million that was never taxed, never declared, never officially acknowledged. $300 million that moved through count rooms and briefcases and car trunks and safe deposit boxes and eventually vanished into the financial bloodstream of 4 major American cities. And the machine that made it all possible started long before the skim itself. It started with a union pension fund and a man named Jimmy Hoffa. In the 1950s, if you wanted to build a casino in Las Vegas, you had a problem. Banks would not touch you. Wall Street did not exist yet in the way it does today. And the kind of money you needed to build a 1,000-room hotel in the Nevada desert was not the kind of money you could raise at a church social. So the mob went looking for a bank of their own. They found one inside the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. The Central States Pension Fund was, on paper, one of the largest pension funds in America. Hundreds of thousands of truck drivers, Warehouse workers and freight handlers paid into it every week, trusting that the money would be there when they retired. By the early 1960s, the fund controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. Jimmy Hoffa ran the Teamsters, and Jimmy Hoffa had friends. The relationship between Hoffa and organized crime figures was not a secret. Federal investigators had been documenting it for years. Robert Kennedy made destroying Hoffa a personal crusade during his time as Attorney General. But documentation and conviction are two different things. And while the government built its case, the Central States Pension Fund quietly became the financing arm of the Las Vegas mob. The man who made the connection work was Alan Dorfman. Dorfman was the stepson of Paul Red Dorfman, a Chicago outfit associate who had introduced Hoffa to mob leadership in the 1940s. Alan Dorfman became the fund's insurance consultant and eventually its de facto loan officer. He controlled who got money and who did not. And what Alan Dorfman approved was breathtaking in its scale. The Stardust, funded in part by Teamsters money, the Fremont, the Hacienda, the Dunes. Caesar's Palace received a $9 million loan in 1969. Circus got Teamsters financing. The Landmark Hotel and Casino, one property after another, built on the backs of truck drivers who had no idea their retirement savings were financing organized crime's expansion across the Nevada desert. Between 1960 and 1980, the Central States Pension Fund made more than $200 million in loans to Las Vegas casino projects. The interest payments flowed back to the fund, satisfying regulators that the loans were legitimate investments. But the real return on investment happened in the casinos themselves, in the count rooms, in the skimming operations that the mob ran on the properties they had essentially bought with other people's money. Alan Dorfman was convicted of bribery in 1982 in connection with a scheme to steer a Teamsters loan in exchange for a bribe. He was sentenced to prison on January 20th, 1983. 2 weeks before he was supposed to begin his sentence, Alan Dorfman walked out of a Chicago restaurant and was shot 12 times in the head at close range. He never said a word to the government. He never had to. He already knew the rule. In this world, silence was the only currency worth more than cash. By the early 1970s, 4 organized crime families had carved up Las Vegas with the precision of a contract negotiation. Kansas City controlled the Tropicana. Chicago had its fingers in the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. Milwaukee ran its own operations through front men in the Stardust's management structure. Cleveland had the Desert Inn through connections going back to Mo Dalitz. The arrangement was almost bureaucratic in its orderliness. Each family sent representatives to Las Vegas. Not bosses, never bosses. Bosses stayed home. They sent men who existed in the space between legitimate businessman and criminal operative. Men who could pass a background check if the investigator did not look too hard. The front men were the masterpiece of the entire operation. In Kansas City, the boss was Nick Savella, a compact, precise man who ran his organization like a corporation and treated the Las Vegas skim as a revenue stream to be protected at all costs. Savella had a representative in Vegas, Carl Thomas, who managed the Tropicana's relationship with the outfit. Thomas collected the skim, reported the numbers, and moved the money back to Kansas City through a chain of couriers so careful that the FBI spent years just trying to understand the basic mechanics of it. In Chicago, Tony Spilotro was the street presence. The enforcer. The man you called when someone needed to be reminded of the rules. Spilotro ran what became known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, a crew of burglars and thieves who operated out of a gold and silver shop on West Sahara. But Spilotro's real value to Chicago was not the burglaries. It was the fear he created. When you knew Tony Spilotro was in Vegas, you were careful. You stayed in line. You did not skim from the skim. Behind the front men and the enforcers was a communication system that the FBI spent the better part of a decade trying to crack. Messages went through intermediaries. Money moved through couriers. Nothing was ever written down that did not have to be. Phone calls were kept short and deliberately cryptic. The whole system was designed for one purpose: to keep the men who actually made the decisions as far from the evidence as possible. And for a very long time, it worked perfectly. If you want to understand exactly how the skim operated at its peak, you need Frank Rosenthal. Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal arrived in Las Vegas in 1974 as an executive consultant to Argent Corporation, the company that owned the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. He had no gaming license. He had no official management title. He had an annual salary of $4 million and the complete trust of the Chicago outfit. And he ran those 4 casinos with a level of operational obsession that bordered on the clinical. Rosenthal understood something that most casino operators of his era had never fully grasped. The skim only worked if the legitimate casino operation was healthy. A dying casino does not produce enough cash to skim. A thriving casino produces so much cash that a portion of it can disappear without the numbers looking obviously wrong. So Rosenthal made the Stardust thrive. He created the first integrated sportsbook on a casino floor. He hired female blackjack dealers when every other casino on the Strip still used men exclusively. He ran the kitchen with the same perfectionism he applied to the count room. But in the count room, a different set of rules applied. The mechanics of the Stardust skim were elegant in their simplicity. Jay Vandermark supervised the slot operations. He rigged the coin weighing machines so that the weight of coins collected from slot machines was systematically underreported. If a bucket of quarters actually weighed 40 pounds, Vandermark's machines would record 38, 2 pounds of quarters at a time, multiplied across hundreds of machines, running every day, across months and years. The paper records would show one number. The actual cash would be another. And the difference would be bundled, counted in a private room, and handed to couriers who transported it out of Las Vegas in packages that crossed state lines to Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Kansas City. Kansas City's share ran to roughly $40,000 a month at its peak. Chicago took more. Milwaukee took their percentage. Cleveland collected theirs. Between 1974 and 1979, FBI investigators would later estimate that Argent Corporation skimmed somewhere between $7 million and $15 million from those 4 casinos alone. That number represents only what investigators could document. The real figure, agents privately acknowledged, was almost certainly higher. And the Stardust was only one piece of a much larger operation. The Bureau had been watching Las Vegas for years before they understood what they were actually looking at. In the early 1970s, the FBI field offices in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland were each running their own investigations into their respective mob families. They had pieces of the puzzle. They did not yet understand it was one puzzle. The breakthrough came from a wiretap. In 1979, federal agents in Kansas City placed a listening device in the home of a mob associate named Joseph Agosto, who managed the Tropicana for the Kansas City family. What they heard on that wiretap was extraordinary. Agosto discussed the skim openly. He talked about the money, the couriers, the distribution. He mentioned names. He referenced Chicago. He referenced Milwaukee. He gave the FBI, for the first time, a coherent picture of how the entire interstate operation functioned. That wiretap became the foundation of what the FBI called Operation Strawman. Agents began coordinating across field offices. Chicago shared intelligence with Kansas City. Milwaukee's office contributed its files. The pieces that had been scattered across 4 separate investigations suddenly began forming a recognizable pattern. But the FBI faced a fundamental problem. Wiretaps and informants could tell them the money existed. They could tell them roughly how much was moving. What they struggled to prove was the chain of custody. Who specifically handed what amount to whom, on which specific date. The mob's system of couriers and intermediaries was specifically designed to break that chain, and the bosses were careful. Nick Savella in Kansas City communicated through layers of intermediaries so thick that his voice was almost never directly connected to the casino operations in any recording. Chicago's leadership stayed even further back. The architects of the system had built it specifically to be difficult to prosecute. The FBI's response was to go deeper. More wiretaps, more informants, more years of patient, grinding investigative work that would eventually produce one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in American history. But patience has a cost. And while the FBI was building its case, the skim continued. Every day the investigation lasted was another day the money moved. In 1985, federal grand juries handed down indictments in what became known as the Strawman prosecutions. Defendants included the bosses and underbosses of the Kansas City, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Cleveland families. It was the most ambitious organized crime prosecution in the history of Las Vegas. The centerpiece trial was held in Kansas City in 1986. Nick Savella had died of cancer in 1983, sparing himself the courtroom. But his successors were not so fortunate. Carl DeLuna, the Kansas City underboss, who had personally supervised the Tropicana operation, sat at the defense table. So did Joseph Aiuppa, the Chicago boss, Angelo LaPietra, Milton Rockman of Cleveland, Carl Thomas, who had been the Kansas City family's point man in Vegas for years. The evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had recordings, financial records, testimony from cooperating witnesses. They had documentation of the skim going back years. They had the wiretaps from Agosto's house laying out the entire operation in the conspirators' own words. The jury convicted. Aiuppa got 28.5 years. DeLuna got 30 years. Rockman got 24 years. Thomas got 15 years. The sentences were real. These were old men who understood they were almost certainly dying in federal prison. The newspapers declared it the end of the mob's grip on Las Vegas. Federal prosecutors called it the most significant organized crime conviction in American history. The Nevada Gaming Commission pointed to it as proof that the era of mob-controlled casinos was finished. They were right that it was the end of something. They were wrong about what it was the end of. The convictions answered one question, while leaving a far more important one completely untouched. Where was the money? Here is the part of the story that almost nobody tells. The Strawman prosecutions documented the skim through approximately 1979, when the Kansas City wiretaps began generating evidence that could be used in court. The indictments came down in 1985. The trial concluded in 1986. That is a 6-year gap. 6 years during which the FBI was building its case, the mob knew pressure was increasing, and the skim did not stop. It adapted. Former federal investigators who worked the Las Vegas cases have said in interviews over the years that the skimming operations they documented in court represented only a portion of the total money taken. The documented skim from Argent Corporation's 4 casinos across 5 years totaled between $7 million and $15 million. The total skim across all mob-connected Las Vegas properties across 3 decades of operation is estimated by some investigators at $300 million or more. Others have put the figure significantly higher. This documented amount was only part of the story. And critically, the final years of the operation, the years after the wiretaps began and before the convictions came down, may have been the most lucrative of all. When an organization knows it is about to lose everything, it tends to take everything it can carry. These were possibly the most lucrative years. Sources familiar with the FBI investigation have indicated that in the period between 1979 and 1984, the pace of cash movement out of Las Vegas casino operations actually increased. The mob's response to federal scrutiny was not to stop. It was to accelerate, to take as much as possible before the hammer fell. And the money that moved during those final years, unlike the earlier skim that was documented through painstaking financial forensics, moved in ways that investigators could track only partially. Cash in car trunks, cash in suitcases on commercial flights, cash deposited in increments of $9,900, just below the $10,000 threshold that triggered mandatory bank reporting. Cash moved offshore through mechanisms that the FBI of the early 1980s simply did not yet have the tools to fully trace. Investigators could follow these flows only partially. The convictions in 1986 were real. The sentences were real. But the money that drove the whole operation was already gone. It had been moved, hidden, laundered, and dispersed across an architecture of accounts and assets that the prosecutions never fully reached. The men went to prison. The money did not go with them. That is the question that federal investigators, financial forensic experts, and organized crime researchers have been asking for 40 years. And the honest answer is that nobody knows completely. But the evidence points in several directions. Some of it went to real estate. The 1970s and the 1980s were a golden era for organized crime investment in legitimate real estate. Cash that had been skimmed from Las Vegas casinos moved through intermediary accounts and emerged as down payments on apartment buildings, commercial properties, and land developments across the Midwest and the Southwest. The money became clean through the simple alchemy of real estate transactions, where cash has always flowed more freely than in other industries. Some of it went offshore. The Cayman Islands, Panama, Liechtenstein, Switzerland. The mob's financial advisors in this era were sophisticated men who understood the emerging landscape of offshore banking. Accounts opened in fictitious names. Shell companies layered inside other shell companies. Money that could be accessed but never easily traced to its origin. Some of it was literally buried. This is not a metaphor. Ted Binion's 6 tons of silver and $7 million in cash, buried in a concrete vault in Pahrump, is the most famous example. But investigators familiar with Las Vegas organized crime cases have documented multiple instances of mob-connected figures hiding cash in walls, beneath concrete floors, and in underground storage on properties they controlled. Some of it was simply spent on houses in Scottsdale and Palm Springs and Fort Lauderdale, on cars and jewelry and boats, and on the accoutrements of men who had been rich for decades and had no intention of pretending otherwise. These were men who had lived well since the 1950s and continued living well through the 1990s and beyond. The IRS pursued tax cases against several figures connected to the Las Vegas skim after the Strawman convictions. Some of those cases resulted in additional convictions for tax evasion. But tax cases are blunt instruments. They can establish that a man spent money he did not declare. They cannot easily reconstruct where that money originally came from or where the majority of it ultimately went. The $300 million figure that investigators and researchers have cited over the years is almost certainly incomplete. It accounts for what could be documented. What could not be documented, by definition, remains invisible. Not everyone connected to the Las Vegas skimming operations went to prison. Not even close. Frank Rosenthal was never arrested for the skim, never indicted for it, never convicted of it. He was denied a gaming license and banned from Nevada casinos. In October 1982, someone put a bomb under his Cadillac Eldorado on East Sahara Avenue. He survived because his specific model of Cadillac had a metal plate in the chassis that deflected the blast. Pure chance. The kind of luck that makes a man wonder what he owes the universe. Rosenthal moved to Florida. He ran a sports bar. He consulted for offshore gambling operations. He lived another 25 years and died in 2008 at the age of 79 in his own bed of natural causes. In his world, that was a remarkable achievement. Jay Vandermark, the slot manager who rigged the coin scales at the Stardust, disappeared entirely before the indictments came down. He vanished in Mexico under circumstances that were never fully explained. His son was later found dead in Phoenix. Jay Vandermark himself was never found. He was never brought back to face charges. The man who engineered the mechanical heart of the largest documented casino skim in American history simply ceased to exist as far as the justice system was concerned. Numerous lower-level figures who moved cash, kept books, and served as couriers in the skim operation were never charged with anything. They knew enough to know nothing. They did their jobs, took their cuts, and disappeared back into the normal world when the heat came. Several witnesses who initially cooperated with federal investigators later recanted portions of their testimony or became unavailable for subsequent proceedings. Evidence chains that looked solid during the Strawman investigation developed gaps over time. Appeals dragged through the courts for years. Some of the most significant convictions from the 1986 trial were eventually reduced on appeal. Sentences were shortened. Men who had been expected to die in federal prison walked out earlier than anyone anticipated. And the money they had helped move, the $300 million that had flowed out of Las Vegas count rooms across 30 years, was never seriously pursued as a discrete asset recovery effort. It was referenced in court documents. It was mentioned in sentencing arguments. And then, the courts moved on. Las Vegas moved on too. That's what this city does. Steve Wynn opened the Mirage in 1989, and the Strip transformed overnight. The corporate era arrived. Publicly traded companies with shareholders and quarterly reports and compliance departments replaced the front men and the couriers. The count rooms were surveilled. The cash was tracked. The era of the skim, at least in its classic form, was finished. The neon changed. The names changed. The Stardust came down in 2007, reduced to a cloud of concrete dust and desert wind. The Tropicana closed in 2023. The properties where the skim had operated for decades were demolished, sold, rebranded, transformed beyond recognition. But the money didn't come back with the wrecking ball. $300 million, minimum, possibly more, moved across state lines, hidden offshore, buried in the Nevada desert, laundered through real estate, spent on a generation of comfortable retirements for men who had taken it piece by piece from casino floors where ordinary Americans came to try their luck. The FBI put men in prison. The Nevada Gaming Commission cleaned up the industry. The era of openly mob-controlled casinos ended. On all of those counts, the government can claim victory. But here's the truth this city doesn't advertise. The mob didn't lose Vegas. They retired from it. They took what they came for. They built their lives on it. And they left. The house always wins. But sometimes the men who built the house win even more. They just make sure nobody's watching when they take their cut. And in Las Vegas, in the golden age of the skim, nobody was watching closely enough. The money is still out there. It just doesn't answer to the name it had when it left the count room. That was the story of the mob's last Vegas heist, the greatest theft in American casino history. $300 million, 30 years, and not a single conviction for the best part of it. If you think Vegas ever told you the whole story, think again. And if you love discovering what really happened behind the neon, hit subscribe, because every legend has a story, and Vegas never forgets.